Please join now in a responsive reading. It's adapted from the words of Martin Luther King Jr. and appears in our most recent hymnal supplement called Lifting Our Voices. I will read a line and invite you to respond by reading the following line along with Halcyon. The words will appear at the bottom of your screen. This is why we are here.
Where do we go from here?
First, we must massively assert our dignity and worth.
We must stand up amidst a system that still oppresses and develop an unassailable and majestic sense of values.
What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive.
And that love without power is sentimental and anemic.
Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice.
And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love.
And this is what we must see as we move on. Joseph Tuckerman was an early Unitarian minister in Boston who was born shortly after the Declaration of Independence was signed. He was born on January 18th, 1778, and tomorrow is the 242nd anniversary of his birth. You've probably never heard of him. His father was what we would now call a developer. He bought swaths of land, subdivided them, and built residential and commercial buildings on them. He also was the founder of the first fire insurance company in the new nation. We tend to look at the American Revolution as being a short war with clear sides and a few significant battles. But really, it was a time of great unrest, conflicts, and mistrust. You couldn't just assume that your neighbor held the same political views as you. Most communities were populated by people who were for independence and others who were loyal to the throne. Each side saw itself as right, and the tension between them got played out in small skirmishes that popped up across the colonies with opposing troops and civilians involved on each side. George Washington became president when Tuckerman was 11 years old and left office after 2 terms while Tuckerman was studying at Harvard. In 1897, nobody was quite sure how the succession of power would work, which was worrisome considering that up to that point, transitions were never smooth. The Washington administration had to work hard to make the transition peaceful, setting up an expectation that endured until last week. Obviously, Tuckerman grew up in challenging times, but his parents managed to give him what we'd think of as a normal childhood. He went off to study at Harvard College. His roommates were William Ellery Channing, who came to be known as the father of Unitarianism, and Joseph Story, who went on to become the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. Channing and Story described Tuckerman as an uninspired student. He graduated, but he had to do a bit more studying before he was ready to be called to serve the Congregational Church in Romney Marsh, which is now the town of Chelsea, Massachusetts. He served for about 25 years, faithfully, even if he didn't get much recognition beyond his congregation. Slowly, he grew bored with preaching, saying that he had lost his voice. And that happened just as ministers like Channing were speaking out loudly and publicly against the whole idea of the Trinity. Channing and other ministers didn't buy it because, as they pointed out, it was never even mentioned in the Bible and didn't become doctrine of Christianity until centuries after the death of Jesus. Their speaking out created a crisis, which came to a head when they were thrown out of the fold of the Congregational Church and together formed the American Unitarian Association in 1825. While Channing and others were using their voices to form a new religion, Tuckerman was growing more silent. So he decided to start a public ministry working in the city of Boston. The way he did it was unusual, to say the least. He had absolutely no idea of what he was doing. He didn't lay out a grand plan for securing funding to get a building and start charitable projects. He just listened. He walked around the neighborhoods of Boston, the neighborhoods that were plagued by poverty, illness, alcoholism, and violence. And he listened. He listened to the stories of mothers who'd been abandoned by their husbands, the stories of fishermen who could never make enough to support themselves and their families, the stories of children who had to work, often selling their own bodies to men because their parents couldn't support them financially. While he got to know folks, he shared their stories with the ministers of churches that were forming the American Unitarian Association in and around Boston. They wanted to help Tuckerman, so they formed the Benevolent Fraternity of Unitarian Churches in 1826. In its founding documents, Tuckerman wrote that the fraternity was being established for the purpose of creating a ministry at large, a ministry whose object it shall be to seek out those who, to be found, must be sought. In other words, the disenfranchised people of Boston were so lost they could never find their way out, and the fraternity and its member congregations were committing themselves to the gentle art of accompaniment. Tuckerman may not have been brimming with self-assurance when he started on his mission, but he got this right. He didn't force his own vision of ministry on other people based on what he wanted to do. He listened to people, listened to their needs, then determined what he could do to help and found human and financial resources to support the people he sought to serve. He ended up ministering mainly to seamen and their families living along Boston Harbor. In those days, the waterfront wasn't beautiful. It was where the dirtiest work happened. Living on the waterfront then was like living under a freeway in an industrial area now. He found a home there, among people who appreciated his presence, and he received as much as he gave. He believed everyone was worthy of the love of God, and that everyone was morally equal, that the most revered judge or doctor was no better than a trash collector. But that didn't happen automatically. He believed you had to earn respectability by being moral and hardworking. The work itself didn't matter. What mattered was the quality of the work and the quality of your heart as you did the work. Joseph Tuckerman was a man about town. He wasn't a charismatic leader who could influence people into buying into his dreams and doing the work to make them happen. He was not what anyone would call a cult leader. He was committed to making his town better and to accompanying his neighbors as they improved their own lives. He was also what we would now call a libertarian. He believed, based on his travels in England and France, that government could not cure social ills. Government, he was sure, would only make things worse. He believed anything could be fixed by caring individuals, but only if they chose to help, not because they were required to. In those days, the American Unitarian Association didn't really yet know how it would function. It was eager to fund social ministry and supported the Benevolent Fraternity until it finally closed its doors in 1997. Tuckerman was a person nobody would ever have described as being particularly robust. He was always in fairly poor health, until the day when he was 62, a friend convinced him to take a trip to Cuba, thinking the warmth, sun, and air would help him recuperate. He departed with his daughter, hoping to return revived, but he died shortly after arriving in Havana. His life was short. He was known only to a pretty small community of people. But Joseph Tuckerman's legacy is lasting. Today, he is considered the father of community ministry in Unitarian Universalism. But more importantly, he's still regarded as a pioneer in a field we now call social work, accompanying people through difficult times and helping them find the resources they need, resources they may already have within themselves, but also resources available out in the world, even resources provided by government. So we've been leading worship now online
10 months.
For 10 months. 10 months. That's a lot of services. One of the things that I've really enjoyed this, because I feel like enjoyed about this because it's such a creative outlet and it's a great way of connecting, the different videos that we've done. Oh my God, I loved when we did the tasty videos.
Oh, really?
No.
We should do another video of the one-handed cook.
and oh man, I love when we did the Halloween service with
Yeah, we got a lot of compliments on that. I mean, it tickled people, and they're like, wow, we have so many great actors. And we're like, well, they were all kind of telling the true story.
So what else can we do? I feel like, we've got this amazing opportunity over the next few months to make a few more of these kinds of movies. Congregation in Colorado, where they took a song from the Lego movie, Everything's Not Awesome. They each videoed themselves lip syncing to this song. Like, could we do that with some kind of like Broadway song?
Yeah, we could do that easily. We just need to find the right song. Well, what's happening in February?
Well, there's Valentine's Day.
You know what we could do? A little movie about Unitarians falling in love with Universalists and having this little love affair and sending each other Valentine's cards.
It's playing a little fast and loose with history, because really it was more like two people being put together by a matchmaker that they didn't really trust.
Oh my goodness, because everything's online now, we can make it so it's a dating service.
So this is my San Francisco history in a way that really makes me think of the Summer of Love. And remember how there were all those music festivals, like Woodstock and everything? Mm-hmm. And then there were all these great documentaries that got made of all of those. What if we did sort of a documentary? Different people in the congregation are making little videos of their families and their little pods, and then we piece it all together as if we were just big gigantic crowd, and somehow it was like this love-in music festival that's happening.
How would we make it look like a crowd?
Yeah. It can be done. I mean, you can make anything happen, right? I mean, in the movies, they do it all the time. There's like 12 people in the studio. Somehow they make it look like a giant crowd.
Right.
Wow, what if we did something like completely different? Like still did that documentary format, but did like a mockumentary, like Christopher Guest, with This Is Spinal Tap and Best in Show. We make social isolation seem super dramatic and exciting. We could call it Pew. I don't know. I mean, let's not get too mired in the detail here. What else could we do?
Because of my education, I go to like doing a little short animation, quotes in the back of the hymnal. Instead, what if we did a video of the lost Easter egg? So having the little Easter egg be animated while it's moving out. What are some of our monthly themes? I know one is becoming. I think
one of the ones that's coming up, is becoming. Wait, you know what that makes me think of? Have you ever read Kafka's Metamorphosis?
No.
It's a story about this guy who slowly turns into this giant bug. Like, what if we did this silly movie about, like, based on Metamorphosis, where people in all the isolation sort of lose who they are and slowly turn into characters in their favorite books?
You know what I think of when I think of becoming? You look at this baby and you don't know what this baby is going to grow up to be.
Famous, or they could become infamous. They could be Barack Obama, or they could be Jeffrey Dahmer.
Exactly.
So how about if we did something about vaccines? There's something interesting about the way that vaccines develop. And somebody was telling me recently about reading an article, the way that we think about vaccines has evolved.
It would definitely have to be a History Channel movie, or, what started this whole conversation. I know that they're wanting to do for fundraising, teaching people to cook on Zoom.
We're actually doing a cooking class on the 30th.
For example, first Wednesday night recipes that everybody loved and everybody wanted to know how we made.
I'm telling you, I love our process.
The 10 ideas, you have to write down 10 ideas.
And you know, the thing that we've gotten really good at we don't get all bogged down picking apart each idea. They flow from one to the next.
What I also like is, or you tell me an idea and I'm like, okay, cool. But I think about your idea, it stimulates a different one. And sometimes we do both, sometimes we do neither, and sometimes those two ideas morph into one. And that's the way it's supposed to work.
It's a pretty good process. It really works for us, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Joseph Tuckerman became a minister in exciting times. The nation was still young in its second presidential administration. Unitarianism was still a word used as an epithet by traditional Congregationalists to describe what they called a heresy. But the theology was on the verge of coming into its own. Boston was changing from a small agrarian town where cattle still grazed on the commons into a booming city. Newcomers were arriving for work from hamlets and villages and other countries, especially Ireland. The nation was in the middle of its first industrial revolution, when iron and chemicals were being produced using the power of water or steam. When you think about it, you can see that Tuckerman's times were a lot like our own, with excitement in the world, but also a lot of innovation. But excitement and innovation don't always feel good. They can make your life feel upended, out of control. So we can often feel resistant to change. Most of us hate adapting, especially when we feel like we have to adapt or die. And right now, because of this stupid virus we can't seem to get under control, we're home, bored, lonely, and most of all, wondering what the world is going to look like when we can finally get back to life as usual. One of the things that's clear to me is that when all this ends, we're going to have to rethink it all, because nothing is ever going to look exactly the same again. At the end of the First Industrial Revolution, the democracy of the Republic felt fairly secure, except for the issue of slavery. Tuckerman was serving a small congregation in a sleepy little village, and I'd bet anything he found the relationships with his congregants to be fulfilling. But he clearly didn't like preaching. He was bored in his ministry and desperately needed to rethink it. Now, while I can tell you with absolute certainty that I am not bored in my ministry with you, I am in a similar situation right now. Joe and I are figuring out what comes next. We've made a decision for him to be in search for a new ministry position, which will determine where in North America we land next. I'll follow along, and when we arrive there, I'll have the opportunity to assess the situation, our finances, and the needs of the local community to figure out what exactly comes next for me professionally. I have this crazy idea that part of it will include work with individuals to create sacred space in their own lives, both spaces in their homes and time dedicated to meditation and reflection. At the same time, I'd like to work with congregations, Unitarian, Universalist, and otherwise, to help them use their physical spaces more effectively. In a post-pandemic world, where there's likely to be a huge surplus of unused commercial spaces and shrinking participation in faith communities, there may be some demand for what I offer. At least I hope so. I'll be a little like Tuckerman, a minister at large, mostly self-supporting, but with a much larger community. While I won't be with you at Shoure anymore after June 30th, I find myself imagining what will happen for you after I leave. What will a new minister teach you? And what will you teach them? How will you respond to them and their vision? How will your vision of ministry be affected by the events of the last few years? What will you do with your space? And what will you have to offer a world whose needs will likely be radically different from what they are now? There's a lot to imagine. A couple weeks ago, I said, I can't imagine anything less imaginative than talking about imagination. Dissecting the workings of imagination seems to me to strip it of its magic, its unexplainable energy. But it's worth thinking about imagination a bit in order to move forward into an unknown future. Halcyon recently stumbled upon an article about 8 different types of imagination processes, an article that she shared with me. I won't bore you with all of them, but I think there are a few worth looking at. You just got a chance to peek into the creative process that Halcyon and I engage in regularly. Basically, we brainstorm. We try to just throw creative ideas out there without spending too much time picking them apart or getting mired in details. We just let one thought flow to the next. In a good brainstorming session, we can come up with a dozen ideas, 2 or 3 of which we might actually use. The trick is to keep moving, to let the ideas flow so that their energy creates more energy. That kind of thinking is an example of effectuative imagination, a process in which we synthesize existing stories, circumstances, and information and turn them into something new. The ideas we generate aren't completely new. They're usually built on other ideas, but effectuation imagination lets us create something that is our own, unique to our context and setting and time. I also share with you a story about Joseph Tuckerman. Having cut my ministerial teeth in community ministry, I knew a bit about his work, but not so much about the man. So I took the opportunity to read about his life and to read some of his writings while paying attention to the context in which he lived. His family, theology, politics, and place in history, to create a story that had never been told before in quite that way. That kind of thinking is an example of intellectual imagination, when you work with existing information toward a distinct purpose. It's a very conscious and deliberate process. But the way Joseph Tuckerman worked was a bit different and more complicated than effectuative or intellectual imagination. feeling a need for personal change and a sense that something needed fixing. He went into the city with no preconceived notions about what he could do or how he could make it happen. He paid attention to what was going on in the city, who lived there, what their needs were, and what he had available to him. His skills and an unspecified commitment from Unitarian churches in the area. He also had the American Unitarian Association behind him, which had its own hopes for how it could help generate compassion, charity, and even justice in the Boston area. Tuckerman talked to people. He listened to their stories as he took an assessment of his own skills and his own boundaries. He had to figure out what he was able and willing to do. Then he found where the needs of the community and the resources available intersected and created something that was completely unique to that time, and more importantly, to that setting. He was a man whose work was all about the town where he was working. Like Martin Luther King Jr., had he been in a different place or a different time, his work and his message would have looked completely different. The big difference between the two men, though, is that Tuckerman had a choice. His work was local. He was backed financially by his denomination, and frankly, he lived on his wife's wealth. Reverend King had no such choice. He was minister to an entire nation under siege in a time of profound violence and change. I don't think he ever felt like he had a choice. And that put his life in constant danger. In the next few months, you, the members and friends of East Shoure, are going to be faced with a lot of major decisions. Calling a new minister, deciding when and how to reopen and when it will be safe to do so. Figuring out how to address the needs of both people who want to gather in person and people who, for whatever reason, want to join you remotely. What to do with a building that will likely be underutilized in a market that is gutted with vacancies. How to continue working on your mission to love, revere, discover, and connect as the demands of that mission become more intense in the face of racism, anti-Semitism, and political divisiveness that isn't going away anytime soon. You've been through tough decisions before. You've used your effectuative, intellectual, strategic, empathetic, and other kinds of imaginations to come up with solutions to the problems and opportunities presented to you. And you've made decisions you could be proud of. Now, sure, there may not always have been decisions that seem like the best with benefit of hindsight. But they're decisions you've made using whatever information and resources you had available to you at the time, always with the best interests of the congregation, its members, the mission, and the community at heart. And that's a lot to be proud of. It probably feels like kind of a weird thing that I'm talking about this right now with everything else going on in our nation. But it's the right time. The hiring team is working in the early stages of the process to bring you a new minister in August. And in just a few weeks, you'll have an idea who will be coming here. As vaccines are rolling out across the state, you'll be faced with the decision about when to open, to whom, and under what conditions. You're going to have to think imaginatively, taking everything into account. Politics, racial justice, oppression in all its forms, and shifting expectations of what a congregation is supposed to be. I'll be with you here for a while longer, accompanying you the way Joseph Tuckerman accompanied the people of Boston's harborfront neighborhoods, and the way the Unitarian congregations of the city accompanied him. Joseph Tuckerman had an advantage few ministers have today: the backing of multiple congregations. You see, back when the American Unitarian Association was still brand new, it didn't look much different from the Congregational Church at the time, which was still receiving money from the government as the state church. Plus, other congregations were very serious about their commitment to their covenant with each other. They expected to work together and to hold each other accountable to their mission. It's not really like that anymore. No money comes from the government to support us. Our Unitarian Universalist Association works for us and we pay them. And honestly, congregations have a hard time finding the energy and commitment to work together, let alone the resources to jointly support a community ministry that benefits a whole metropolitan area. My hope is that when the pandemic ends, all that will start to change. I hope we'll be more interested in working together. And I think after all the work that we've had to do to maintain ourselves through this isolation, that might just happen. In the meantime, we need your support. East Shore needs you to send in a check to fulfill your pledge during this unexpected church year, so we can continue to be here for you and for our wider community. If you're new to East Shore and you haven't pledged, please consider sending us a donation to show your support for the congregation, for Unitarian Universalism, for our mission. We're happy to provide you the opportunity to join us. Thank you for being here.
This life is a journey we all hae to gang, and care is the burden we carry along. Though heavy be our burden and poverty our lot, we'll be happy all together our a wee drappy old. The trees are all stripped o' their mantles sae green, the leaves o' the forest nae longer can be seen. For winter is here, it's cold and icy cold, but we're all met here together, our a wee drappy oat. Our a wee drappy oat, a wee drappy oat. We're all met here together, our a wee drappy oat. Job in his lamentation said man was made to mourn, and there was nae pleasure frae the cradle to the urn. But in his meditation he surely had forgot the pleasure man enjoys our a wee drappy oat.
We join hands in Unitarian Universalist fellowship, pledging ourselves to an individual religious freedom which transcends all creeds, not to think alike, but to
journey together.
journey together.
Let's make that a blooper.